Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extension of what we're talking about, which is, just this is still a young space, which I think always is dissonant for people to understand because it's so based in, so rooted in technology. I mean, do you feel like, I don't know, who does a good job of sort of covering these types of, erotic games and sort of taking them seriously? Do you feel like is it the burgeoning field of games academia? Are there outlets within journalists you feel doing a good job, or is this sort of by and large still today treated as a separate? I don't even know if it's separate but equal. It's just treated as like a separate entity that isn't even part of it. Because I think the only times you see these types of games pop up on a lot of the sites we're talking about, it'll have a headline probably with the words controversy or offensive or sociopath or insulting. So what do you think?
Yeah. In my example, I think that I wrote that in my mail to you when we were discussing it originally, that I regard the erotic games industry as the shady alley to the AAA game industry, this well-lit boulevard. If the video games industry is Las Vegas, I mean, you got the Strip. That's where you get your Call of Duties, your Final Fantasies, and all the, the huge casinos, the mega corporation backers. They have billions of dollars. They have a $560 million budget to produce one game. Yeah. And then you go a couple of streets over, and then you have these small places. You got family-owned restaurants. You got the smaller casinos. They don't have any flashy signs, and the machines are a bit old, but you can still have a good time, and that's the indie market. Yeah. And then you go one block further, and suddenly you're on the wrong side of the tracks. You have barrels with homeless people huddling around them. You have these low-rent hookers standing at the corner, just looking tired, blary, and sick of life. And then you come to this fantastic, nice little brothel with 4 floors, and then there's this guy at front, and he shakes your hands because he recognizes you from the night before, and he's like, "Come on inside, man, we got some good stuff for you." That's the erotic game industry. That's where they're hiding out. And if you have a casino on the Strip, you don't talk about that part of town because you don't want to be associated with it at all. If you are a high roller, if you're someone who goes to those casinos, you don't ever admit that you have even as much as visited that side of the railroad tracks because that's where the bad people go.
Well, but in terms of, I mean, I don't know what the most impressive way to state it is, and I probably should have asked you this, I don't know, about an hour ago. I mean, how big is the industry for erotic games? You said it's as old an industry as home computers, and that many important names in the Japanese games industry have credits in this world that they just probably would want to keep quiet about.
Well, to just drop some names, Koei, the Japanese game industry, started as a aero game production facility, more or less. Enix, the second part of Square Enix Corporation and one of the RPG majors, also started out making pornographic games, published games with pedophilic content, among other things. Sierra Online, before they went on to become the huge industry mover in the mid-90s and early 2000s that they were in the West, they started out porn as well.
Is it true that Nintendo, the Love Hotel stuff, or is that, is that true?
I have looked into that, and there are a lot of conflicting sources. And the problem with digging around and that sort of thing is that Japanese culture does not allow for you to speak ill of your employer, current or previous. So you would have to find someone who was actually deep enough in there that he can, tell you yes or no, but still dislikes Nintendo enough today that he would be willing to talk about it. And I think that finding such a person is slightly beyond my means right now.
No, that's okay. I've heard the rumors as well.
But let's say yes.
It wouldn't be. Yes, you've heard it here first. It wouldn't be far-fetched, in other words. But I mean, in terms of revenue or just people in it, I mean, how does it compare to the mainstream games industry?
Well, one of the major digital delivery sites for erotic games has a publishing ratio of roughly 2,400 games per year.
Okay.
If you then extrapolate from the number of sales, you can see that we are talking millions and millions and millions of sales every year just from that website. And that is essentially just a small digital outlet and the first foray into digital delivery platforms for these sort of games. But if you look to the industry as a whole, you realize that Japan in particular, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about at least 20,000 people full-time employed just inside this industry. So it's definitely no bucket in the ocean. I mean, this is a inland sea, at least. It is considerably more money and more people than people would like to imagine. Similar to the pornographic industry, where you probably don't realize just how much porn the human race produces. We're really good at it.
Are you a fan of Louis C.K. by any chance?
I have been known to partake of some of his stand-up, yes.
Yes, he basically had a bit, I think in his most recent stand-up special on Netflix, that we can stop making porn, that we have enough to last us the rest of the... I think he said something like, he could spend the rest of his life, every waking hour, watching porn, and by the time he died, he wouldn't be through anal.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. That's a weird segue, but I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you followed some of the, I don't know, turbulence in the more mainstream game industry, just as far as representation in games that are being released. Women involvement, female involvement in the industry, diversity. It's possible I haven't done enough research or prep for this interview, but from what I have read, is it true that this is an area of the industry where historically there has been a lot of by women for women products?
Interestingly enough, I would say that the erotic games industry, at least when it started out, was a lot friendlier to women in terms of employing women than the mainstream industry was. You find a lot of women, especially early on in Japan and early on in America as well, that were actually involved in this industry. And even today, many of the more prolific writers and designers are female, especially in Japan. Now, sadly, this does not result in games that are less misogynistic, but
right.
Everyone has different tastes and all that. But I think that what makes erotic games interesting in terms of representation is that since they are always targeted, I mean, that is one of the interesting things about pornography that you generally don't get with video games at large, that they have a specific idea. It either comes from the person developing them, that they have a kink, or you aim them at people with a certain kink. And this means that there is a large market of erotic video games meant for women. And women of different age groups and different professions. You have erotic video games for girls that are just out of high school, more or less. That are these more romantic visual novel style games that result in you ending up with the handsome tennis coach that all the girls are after. It's essentially romantic escapism, the same way as those terrible little pocket books that you can buy, when you're exiting the near local supermarket. But then you also have more, shall we say, romantically fulfilling games such as marriage simulations, and you have, these stories. I mean, we have 50 Shades of Grey, but with porn in it, actual porn in it, that is meant for women who are past what the Japanese people would call marriageable age. They're in the 30s, they're unmarried, they have no real romantic prospects. There are games made specifically for these women to essentially just escape to, similar to how there are games made for men in their 30s who are romantically or sexually falling behind and feel that they need some sort of material to work with. So in that regard, it's both more representative, and you can say that the erotic games industry has been very early and very clear with that there's something for everyone. It doesn't matter where you're from, what you identify as, what you like, we got you. There's something for you, just don't worry, the bag is huge. Just dig down in there and you will find the perfect fit. You don't really get that in the mainstream video games industry.
Well, I've found. I mean, you chuckled earlier before I started this interview. Just talking, I was talking diplomatically about just people's sort of reluctance to go off message in the game industry. Have you run into anything like that with your a documentary where people don't want to go on record or they don't want to talk openly about their time working on these games?
The interesting thing is that the individual developers are usually the most friendly people I have ever met. They are open, they are super friendly, they answer your questions, and they say, hey man, if you want to know something more, if you want to catch up later, if you have more questions, just send me an email or you can talk on Skype, just contact me. But when you go to the distribution platforms and when you go to the publishers, I contacted that large digital delivery platform provider that I talked about earlier, especially because I thought that they were a really interesting sourcing, as they sell more pornographic games than any other one company in the world. Millions of copies.
What is the name of this company?
Watch my documentary and find out. We're not naming names here because I think that the thing is that they clearly got a bit worried because I contacted them and said that I would like to ask a couple of questions and so on. And I was immediately, I got this very polite and friendly response from their PR representative and asked, what is it for and so on. And I said, I'm looking to do a documentary on the industry itself, and I want to see what the publishing practices are like and want to hear about your experiences. They never replied. Just immediate cut off. They realized, nope.
Yeah.
So individual developers will happily talk to you about their work, but the publishers, they are very, very careful. And I think that it is very obvious why. And I think many of the developers that I've spoken to have actually noted this, is that they don't want to become mainstream. They don't want to be, they don't want the public to become aware of who they are and what they do. Because a lot of the times their games contain things that if it was brought out into the public eye, it would be over. Like someone would call the police. And then...
Well, I mean, where I am, I can't even buy those games.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, a lot of the fan base, and I mean, honestly, there are fan bases. I mean, several of the more prolific developers and people who have put out many good games. And I mean, there are good games in this industry, believe it or not. They have actual, honest-to-God fan bases, and they are forced to buy these prepaid Japanese credit cards in fake names using P.O. boxes in Hokkaido in order to be able to purchase these games from Japanese delivery platforms. Because there is no way to publish this material in the West due to the difference in our laws.
Yeah.
I mean, there are simple things. I mean, you often see, for example, monsters on girl or monster girls on men in the Japanese erotic game industry, because that is, I mean, wow, I have an entire separate episode of the documentary about that stuff, because it is really culturally significant and really interesting from many perspectives, but let's skip that for now. But
sure.
The thing is that those sort of depictions are actually illegal in the US because they fall under the various Decency Act, and you are not allowed to depict sexual relations between an animal and a human being. Now, you can argue as much as you want that, oh no, this is not a dog, this is actually a shadow hound demon, and it has comparable intelligence to an 18-year-old, so therefore it can consent. The FBI won't care.
Yeah.
So the publishers, they don't want their names to be publicized, they don't want their business to be openly publicized, because they realize that the moment they become just public knowledge, then the lawmakers and the various organizations that keep track of these things, they are going to come down on them like hawks.
Do you think that response is it like a quintessentially Japanese approach to managing an image?
Well, I have studied Japanese both as a language, and I have studied Chinese and Japanese history at the university because I'm a huge weeaboo. That term, by the way, for those unfamiliar, means someone who really enjoys Japanese culture a little bit more than they should.
I recognize it. I haven't heard that word in a while. I'm still a mere gaijin myself. Yeah, you knew that, though.
Good. But
continue.
The thing about the Japanese is that they can't say no. You never say no, especially not when you are in a service environment. You say yes, you nod, but you mean no. They say, we will look into it, or we will see what we can do. That means no. So in this case, it is actually the same thing. They say, oh, we will be glad to help you. Please send in your questions. And then they actually close the ticket and they pretend it never happened.
Well, it's interesting because I wonder about that a lot with this project, is sort of the ways the Japanese culture and Japanese business culture, which is a very nebulous thing, sort of how that has gotten exported and, integral to the core of the Western game industry. Because I think back on Gamergate, and it's almost like the game companies had they completely shut down, didn't know how to respond, and I wondered if part of that is, sort of like a Japanese protocol of a way of responding to controversy.
Well, I think it was that, and also that they were generally confused. A lot of the Japanese developers that were interviewed during that time, they talked about ethics in gaming journalism, misogynistic depiction of female characters, and then you have people like Yoko Taro is just like, I like girls. Give her a big butt.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the designers behind, Senran Kagura, Dead or Alive series, and so on, and they just go, well, girls with big boobs, it's great. I don't see the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because they literally do not see the problem. Because their society is still so deeply entrenched in patriarchal values and the freedom of the performers, so to speak, that they don't really see it as an issue. They essentially just go, well, this product is for boys aged 13 to 29, and most boys aged 13 to 29 like attractive women with big breasts, so that is what we will put in the game. And then their analysis just stops. So when the West came calling and said, hey, how can you do this? I mean, how can you put this into your games? They were initially confused. And then, as you said, they fell back on the, yes, we will look into it protocol of, thank you for your questions, we will see about finding someone who can answer them, and then they just never call back.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah, well, it helped time pass, if nothing else. And I guess, I feel even weird, like, even mentioning or discussing Gamergate 3 years later, but, you mentioned that something that you wish people would stop obsessing over when it comes to video games is maturity, and I think you sort of you used an example of sort of the least mature entries in a medium sort of being accused of slowing down progress, like in movies, like saying that low budget slashers are preventing movies from mainstream acceptance. But we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but how do you sense sort of mainstream acceptance for video games is different or going through different challenges than other mediums?
Well, we can say that especially major publishers are putting a lot of effort into maturing games. Kevin Spacey was in Call of Duty, for crying out loud. And the thing is that a lot of people seem to think that the lowest common denominator in any given medium is that defines its maturity as a form of media, which is, of course, entirely horribly wrong. Any sort of media, especially an interactive medium, cannot be judged on individual titles.
Is that a Western phenomenon, you think?
I think that it is more present in Western culture. It is present in Eastern culture as well. There will always be people complaining that, oh, a Friday the 13th movie, wow, good work destroying the movie business, It's like, come on, it's for fans of slasher flicks who like low-budget slasher flicks. Those are the only ones who are going to watch it. Who cares? But the whole struggle for the art form and being legitimized. We need to show that we can do it too. Our medium is mature, it has advanced. We're beyond that whole low effort 2D platformer stuff. Look at our fantastic game with its cinematic cutscenes and so on. And then in comes some indie dude on Steam and made, oh hey, I made Troll Face launch.
Yeah.
And people just go, oh damn it, you ruined it. We almost had them that time.
I mean, when it comes to, I just think this is not a thing that's unique to games at all. Like I know it's not. There's like I think Last Tango in Paris had a sodomy rape scene, and A Clockwork Orange had a lot of rape in it, and like you mentioned, Roman brothels. There's Greek marble statues. There's oil paintings. There's penny dreadfuls. There's slash fiction. I mean, why do you think we're so bad at sort of recognizing these patterns and being a little bit more open-minded and tolerant to them?
I think it has a lot to do with the theory of the gap, in that the more different from the mainstream something is, the more immediately we react to it. That's how the human brain is programmed. We react far stronger to negative input than we do to positive input. For example, someone can tell you good work today for like 3 months straight, and then they say that one day they take us and you didn't quite perform up to snuff today. You might want to take a look at that. That will stay with you. That will immediately just crush you emotionally, and you go, "Oh my God, I'm the worst in the world." It is a similar thing in media as well, where we have this huge sea, and then suddenly we see something popping up that we don't like, and we slam down and go, "This is not acceptable. This is bad. This makes everything around it look bad. You have to stop." And we don't realize that pieces of media are not people. We have this sort of, how to put it, almost social curation need, that we need to ensure that people in that are near us, that are in our social circles, that they all behave to a certain standards, because we do not want to look bad because we're associating with them. And we have the same thing in media, in that I play this game, but a similar game is terrible, or a similar game has subject content that makes it offensive, or people who make the games like these also make these terrible porn titles. That's bad, because people will associate those games with my game, and they will associate this game that I'm playing, my game, with me, and then that will reflect badly on me. So it is essentially this desperate attempt to curate the media so that the bad parts of the medium you enjoy sort of disappear into the darkness where no one will find them, because otherwise they will think that you enjoy those things as well.
But I mean, nothing exists in a vacuum. I mean, have you noticed ways that mainstream games have been influenced by these types of games?
Well, I think we can safely claim that the visual novel as a form of presentation in video games would probably not even have existed in its current form if not for the erotic games industry. There are also a lot of genres, especially on the more adult and mature side, that I don't think people would have dared to go as far as they did if there were not games that had tried it before and gotten away with it. I mean, on one end of the scale, we have things that just would completely never have any real beneficial effects, such as Custer's Revenge. I mean, that's just trash. It's trash. We don't even have to discuss that. But on the other hand, you have the early CD-ROM games on the PlayStation, with the romantic visual novels, and on the home PCs, people were making these guides for married couples, how to essentially engage in sexual contact and how to improve your sex life and stuff like that. And those became building blocks of a foundation that you could then push more risk content up into the mainstream. I mean, putting a sex scene in a video game would probably have been completely unthinkable if we had not proven in the 80s with various more, porny video games that it's fine, we can get away with it. Because you never want to be the first person to put out a mainstream title that pushes that sort of boundary. Because if it fails, such as when people found the hot coffee mod for San Andreas, then you end up in a lot of hot coffee.
Yeah.
You get scalded something terribly, and people will not stop talking about it. Well, sure, it's good for your marketing. It will make people pick up the game because they're intrigued of what's going on. But it leads to a lot of legal fees.
I spent a lot of time digging into the bigger budget space on my project and sort of looking at the cycle of labor abuses and other things that sort of persist due to some of the media apathy we discussed before, in part due to that. Do you feel like the erotic game industry learns from its mistakes more than the mainstream game industry? Does it treat its people better,
Well, overall, I would say resoundingly yes, it does. Because the major advantage of producing and developing erotic games is that it is very much still a indie development scene. You have a lot of people who help each other. You have a lot of people who work either alone or in small, tight-knit groups. They form and reform. It's basically like, a 80s pop rock band in that, we're switching out our drummer, we're switching out our guitarist, and oh shit, we have a completely new team. None of the original members are here anymore, but we still have the same name, and we still produce the same sort of music. You see the same thing in the erotic games industry. One of the Western developers that I interviewed, he specifically noted that making pornographic games is probably one of the most surefire ways for a lone person fresh out of any sort of computer engineering background in college or university to actually start making money. Because as long as you can produce something that's decently playable and you can commission some decent art, you will turn a profit. You can reach almost bizarre amounts of success with very little effort comparatively, because people are primarily not there for the game itself. They are there for the porn. Because, at the end of the day, it is essentially, depending on how you look at it, either a, sensual aid or a masturbatory aid. And that means that you have a lot of leeway. You can have your game be buggy, you can have your game be a bit ugly, you can have the game mechanics be unsound. It's fine as long as there is something sensually rewarding at the end. And
well, I'm flashing back on the 80s and 90s and scrambled TV channels where people would
sitting there cross-eyed.
It'll help get the job done. So I think maybe that's always been the case then.
So you have a lot of these indie groups, and they can start doing it whenever they want. They're straight out of school. Sometimes they're still even in school, and they're doing it as a side job, part-time job to try and make a bit of extra cash. You make a couple of games, and then you stop, or you continue. You form a studio, you join a studio, or you just keep.
You're saying this is a global thing, not necessarily located in just one region or area.
It's a global thing. you see more and more patrons set up for people who want to develop erotic games in the West, because they have seen the, I can't say resounding success, but at least minor success of the indie development studios specializing in pornographic games that you see in Japan, and they think that we can probably replicate that here. You have to be a bit more careful with the content you use, but the market is there. We know this because there are hundreds of thousands of people in the US alone who we see from their data traffic that they download Japanese pornographic games. And for some time there were digital delivery platforms in the West, as well as physical retailers that carried localized hentai games.
Well, for me, the thing that started to pinball my brain into being more curious about it, and you still are the first conversation I've had on this topic I'd like to do more, is I was invited out to speak at Uppsala University last year, I think almost literally a year ago, so I don't know exactly where in Sweden you are, but not too far, I'm guessing.
I live half a mile from Uppsala University.
Oh, okay, well, perfect. So yeah, I mean, I was hanging out with the head of the program. We were having lunch, and we were talking about just sort of the perceived rise in independent games, them exploring sexuality, and it's sort of being treated by media, by people in the audience as this new thing, when, to my mind, it's connected with the history that you've been talking to me about. I mean, do you feel like it is treated that way? I mean, do you feel like does the independent game space, which is sort of, I guess, historically looked at in modern terms as far as that's sort of the place where the most artistic, endeavor is supposed to be taking place? I mean, do you feel like, are they as curious in making games about sexuality? Do people act like it's a brand new thing that hasn't been explored before?
I think that by and large they do, but I talked to you about that during our little exchange of emails, and that one of the strange things about the video game industry in particular is that everyone wants to reinvent the wheel. Everyone wants to claim that they're first with something. Sometimes it's because they honestly think that they are. They just haven't played enough video games, or they haven't done the research. But sometimes they want to specifically just turn their face away from the games that have come before, and they say, we're going to do this, we're the first to do this, and we're going to make it super good. And then they make all the same mistakes and fall into all the pitfalls, and the game comes out sort of shoddy, and they say, well, at least we explored new ground. But they didn't. And that is one of the major issues I have with the video game industry at large, the whole retreading the same ground, reinventing the wheel, adding different colored spokes, and acting as if that has changed the entire method of motion, so to speak. Instead of looking at what we have, accepting the fact that some sources will be less savory than others, and just act as the sponge. Take in everything, squeeze out what is most unpleasant, and then use what you learned to actually make something interesting. As you say, we have a lot of indie game developers in the West now that are starting to explore sexuality, and for example, there is this wonderful little game on Steam called How Do You Do It? And I mean, that's a wonderful little 4-minute experience that you can replay a couple of times if you like, but it is not anything new. A lot of people think it is because they haven't seen something like that pop up on Steam, but they don't realize that Steam itself is essentially just the junior member in the game delivery platform history. They are basically a modern company, and we have people who were trying to do the same thing already in the mid-90s, but the internet infrastructure wasn't there. You can look backwards and you can see that people have tried all of these things way, way back. I mean, we can connect back to Koei, the Japanese game company. Their very first game, released in 1982, was essentially a game meant for married couples to teach them how to have sex, combined with some pornographic content to, help you get started, fluff you up, essentially. So they essentially made a game. Back when they first started, their first game was a marriage counseling game with a focus on sexuality. When was the last time you saw a game released in the West that focused on marriage counseling?
Never.
Ever.
I didn't even hesitate. I didn't have to think about it.
Last time you saw a game released that tried to help you teach how to pleasure your partner, whether you're male, female, or identifying otherwise? Also probably
never.
I mean, I'm sure that we will get there. It probably won't be published on Steam, most likely, but I think that we will reach the point where we have realized that gamification and the general concept of an interactive medium being helpful to the learning process will catch up with us. And we will essentially get, the Virgin's Guide to Safe Sex or something that will then be happily given out on USB memory sticks in high schools.
Or in VR. Well, I mean, that's another factor too with all this is, that's why VHS won out over the technically superior beta, is because there was porn on VHS, and I've joked that this is even the reason that we live indoors is probably due to pornographic cave drawings. It tends to, shape a lot more of our society than we like to think, or at least we'll discuss in public. I mean, you mentioned this, about with this lack of knowledge of history, that everything old is competing with not only everything new, but also all the old masterpieces. And I think we've sort of talked peripherally, about specifics of what these games are like. But to you, or maybe sort of, more broadly, like what are considered to be the masterpieces of this world, and why?
Well, if we're going to start digging in the erotic games industry in particular, I think that it's less about the masterpieces and more about the masterpiece series. I think that is the interesting thing, that a lot of the more important games in the erotic games industry, they become either franchises or they branch out into the mainstream. I think that one of the main examples, perhaps, is Fate's Stay Night, which originally started out as a visual novel with sexual content, where, in all honesty, the pornographic content, the erotic content, was essentially tacked on because, you need that stuff to, move numbers. You get more sales if there's sex in there. And the PC version even let you choose if you wanted to install it or not. But that reached such huge success that there are now well over half a dozen of these games without any form of pornographic content whatsoever being sold on major platforms, primarily Sony platforms such as the Sony PSP, Sony's PS Vita, and the PS3 and PS4. And I think that for a lot of them, that is essentially what they are looking for. They want to have enough success in the erotic games industry that they can smash their way into the mainstream and then stick around. Because the other way around is depressing. That's like when you're a film director that ends up directing porn because your work is not being recognized for its value. Or at least I think that's the sort of feeling it would give off. But speaking of just things that have created an impact, I think that the Rance series is the one that I bring up the most in the documentary because it is interesting for several reasons. For the first, it's a series that is older than Final Fantasy. It should be noted that it's still getting games, which makes it one of the oldest currently published game franchises in existence. It is written entirely by a woman, and one of the lead designers on several of the games was also a woman, so technically speaking, two of the most important roles in the game's production were both women. And despite this, the protagonist, the titular protagonist, Rance, is a horribly misogynistic rapist, but yeah, more about that later, I suppose. And this is a series that had extremely humble beginnings and started moving up to actually, moving decent numbers. We're not talking millions of sales, but we're talking definitely in the tens of thousands, over 100,000 sales, which is surprisingly large numbers for what is essentially porn with a game tacked on.
Right.
And I think that one of the reasons that Rance did so well as it did was because it tried a different approach. It was a game with porn in it instead. And you see that a lot of the more successful or critically recognized games, if you put it like that, in the erotic games industry are just that. They're good games that also have porn in them, because then you get the best of both worlds. Yeah. And I think that is where the erotic games industry needs to mature a little bit further, because the number of low-effort titles still horrifically outnumbers the number of high-effort titles. But, I mean, that isn't terribly unusual in any medium, really.
Yeah, well, I think that's, when I was out, not far from where you are, I was talking to my host about it's just interesting that with games being as young as they are, that they are reluctant to charge into certain directions. It's possible that it's, economic factors and other things largely at play, but, because we have these different spheres of games, I mean, when you see the mainstream media or people in the mainstream talk about the erotic games industry, I mean, what sort of revisionist history do you see that really bothers you?
It is not so much revisionist history as the whole just complete denial that there is any sort of value in it. It is less revisionist history and more repressive history, that, there's nothing but terrible shit and you shouldn't look at it. And no one will ever admit to partaking. I mean, that's the same thing as pornography. I mean, if you ask someone to name a pornographic film, maybe they will, mumble "Das Dallas" under their breath, because it was such an important word that it actually started pouring the plot as a general idea. But when it comes to erotic games, I mean, people will just furrow their brow and go, no, we don't talk about that. It is essentially a denial of history, because I think that the industry itself has a lot of trouble in that they spew out a lot of low-effort games, and they just chug on and on and on and on with the same ideas, the same general content, because this is what sells. This is the general talk, so to speak. Mass produce that shit. Some of these games, I mean, you can have 19, 20, 30 games in a franchise, and they are practically indiscernible unless you have played all the games and memorized the storylines. And the storylines can basically be written out on a napkin, but But you essentially have people that they don't want any history because they're too busy producing things. They just want that stuff out there because they're doing it to make money. There is no higher art form in the erotic games industry, the same that some people are attempting in the mainstream games industry, because they know that it's not what it's meant to be.
Do audiences for erotic games, do they behave similarly to audiences for mainstream games, to the extent where, I think the word entitlement gets thrown around a little too easily, but do these types of behaviors also manifest among audiences for erotic games as well?
Well, there is
just such a huge thing, but
There's a quote that I really like that someone posted on the 4chan image board many, many years ago. It was a Japanese visitor who tried to explain why whenever people are discussing pornography, generally speaking, it is a lot calmer and more polite discourse than when you're discussing other things. And he put it like this: through cock unity. Because we are all sexual creatures. I mean, we are born with genitals. At least overwhelming majority of us are born with genitals, and most of us will at some point in our lives engage in some sort of sexual conduct. And there is such a natural part of who we are and what we need to do in order to procreate and continue as a species, that there is no reason to fight about it. So you see a lot less entitled people, and the consumers are a lot more patient, and they're willing to lower their standards considerably, as I noted earlier, that the game, it's okay if it's not great. As long as it appeals to my kink, it's fine. I mean, you're making this stuff for people like me. I can just say thank you and get on with it. You get a lot of that general feeling among the consumers that, no one else is making anything that is appealing to them. So when you make something that is appealing to them, they will be grateful, even if what you're making isn't necessarily great. But we also have the groups that have started supporting developers either through Patreon or donations or pre-orders and like, and they show the exact same self-entitlement issues that you generally see on the internet. Like, why hasn't the game come out yet? I mean, come on, hurry up. You need to add this because I paid $500 for this. You better add this, you bastard, and so on. And then the game comes out, and immediately people start complaining that, oh, this could have been done better. Oh, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this. But these are, generally speaking, the exact same people you see on social media complaining about the same things in the mainstream. So I think that there's a clear overlap here. There's just that there are a fair number of people in this world who are assholes, and they will always behave like assholes no matter what they're talking about.
This is true. And I think it creates a distorted sense of, what the general temperature is, because not only is it, constricted to people who are on those channels, but also people who are enjoying these games are too busy enjoying them. If you talk to an average 12-year-old who plays video games, they would have no idea how upsetting No Man's Sky was. But I don't know. I mean, I just have like another 2-3 questions here for you. We talked a little bit about people protesting these games, being upset about these games. Why do you think that just ignoring these games and not buying them isn't sufficient for people? If they're so offended by them, why not just focus their efforts on buying the things they want and focusing on those instead?
I think that ties back to what I talked about earlier about the whole social curation thing, that you desperately want things that look bad just to not be present. You see it a lot in parents that they want to essentially make things illegal or forbid the sales of things that may be harmful to children rather than tell their children not to partake. It's the whole nanny government idea that a lot of people on the right tend to complain and whine about, that, you know, why does that Surgeon General have to tell me that cigarettes hurt my health? I know that well enough myself, what an asshole. But you have a lot of people who will not abstain unless they're being told to abstain. There needs to be some sort of authority in their lives that tell them you should do this, you shouldn't do this. Because otherwise they will start feeling insecure, they will be left thinking, okay, what am I supposed to do? They will have a general idea of what's right and what's wrong, but they will not have a ground to stand on. Humans enjoy having a certain degree of authority with which to align themselves. So that's why they will, if they dislike something noticeably, they don't want something in their lives, they will ask an authority to make sure that other people understand that it's bad as well. You saw a lot of movements like that in the 80s where we had, you know, parents against sex on TV, you had parents against violence in video games, you had mothers against violence in media and so on, and their entire message is like, oh, stop forcing this on our children. And we're like, why are you renting these videos for your 8-year-old kid?
Yeah.
That kid can't force his way into a store and steal a pornographic game and install it on your home computer unless you have essentially trained him to do so. There is a certain degree of responsibility involved in these things that I think that some people feel that responsibility should not be theirs. There should be a higher authority handling this. And that is why they start these sort of movements, because they want to make sure that this kind of stuff doesn't spread, it doesn't proliferate, because it goes against their values, they don't like it, but who is to stop it from happening? They can't do it themselves. So
that's what I was thinking, was like, you know, I think you may have even referenced this in your note, but I mean, I remember, you know, there was a time where there was a thing, I don't know if this even has a real term, but just, you know, you would be in the woods and you would just find pornography, forest porn or something. I mean, who would be blamed or protested against in cases like that?
Yeah, I look back at what I wrote. I actually have it in front of me, and I'm a bit embarrassed because I called it the allegory of the forest porn. The cultural impact of a piece of sexual media is only felt by the people who experience it. And for many people there are social taboos or personal ethics hindering them from doing so. And if you do not dare approach, you will also most likely never come into contact with parts you might realize are pretty great. It's essentially the idea of repressed sexuality in this case. You have people, they think of themselves as very clean and very nice, they have some sort of, you know, personal ethics or baggage, or their parents have taught them that don't do this, you do this. The easiest example to bring up are, of course, you know, conservative religious people. You have people who come from Christian cults who say essentially disagree with sex before marriage and depictions of sexual content and so on. Naturally, they will immediately react with shock and horror when they see this sort of thing. They will go, oh no, you can't do that. And you ask why? And because, you know, God said so, or my parents said so, or this book I once read said so, and that's all the authority they have to call back to. And if I say, well, I disagree, they are now presented with that horrific thing of someone of equal authority as you disagreeing with what you have to say. And that is terrifying to a lot of people. You need to then essentially force a movement that either shames this person into agreeing or at least hiding what it is they're doing.
Well, it's just interesting because, you know, I think the way you put it is that this part of the industry sort of exemplifies the kind of equality people say, you know, the broader industry needs. I mean, we mentioned a little bit before about there being a lot more women in the workforce, but do you feel there are other instances of equality where beyond that?
Well, generally speaking, I think there is a great degree of equality of effort put in and reward earned, so to speak. If you're working at a large development firm, or if you're hired by a publisher, generally speaking, you have a set salary, you don't get any returns, you don't get any royalties, and you are sort of forced to make what people are telling you to make. Meanwhile, in the erotic games industry, you grab a friend and then you make something that you want to make, and you reap all the rewards. So in that sense, I think if we look to the poor laborer, if we were going to use socialist ideas, the erotic games industry is a lot more socialist than the mainstream gaming industry, in that it's the worker who reaps the reward of his efforts. If you put in the effort, you're going to get money back. That goes straight to you, and the people who are sitting there with their genitals in their hands are going to applaud you once they're done.
Well, I have just one last question here for you. Is there something specific you felt we didn't get a chance to talk about that you'd like to?
No, not really. I mean, there's really no point in me sitting around talking about my documentary in itself, seeing as it's not yet out. So even if people are interested in seeing it, they will have to wait. So I guess
I'm interested.
Append that to the bottom of the article once you're done, and once my documentary is done. Oh, by the way, if you actually want to see what the heck he's talking about, take a look at this YouTube video.
Go here, yeah. So this will be my last question for you then, which is just, what do you feel video games have accomplished?
I think that video games have accomplished a lot of things that we do not realize, and a lot less than what they claim. Video games have risen from a completely non-existent medium to being bigger than film, and soon probably eclipsing film and literature combined in roughly 40 years. In terms of medium that have a far reach, video games are at this point easily equal to any other medium in history. You have 80-year-olds living out in the woods of Finland who can recognize Mario just by his voice. These are people that may literally be analphabetic. They can't read, and they haven't seen a film since they went into the cinemas last time in 1967, but they will still be able to recognize Mario. Because as a medium, it has the wonderful quality of being whatever you want it to be. There is a game for everyone in the same way that there's a book for everyone or there's a movie for everyone, but the advantage is that video games are interactive. And I think that that is the biggest thing that video games have achieved. We have finally created a medium that is interactive in a way that we have never before seen. You can become part of what is going on in a way that you can't with a book or a film. You can imagine yourself to be in a place. You can imagine that you are the protagonist of the book. You can put yourself into the situation. You can empathize with them. But in a video game, you can be the center of attention in a way that you could never achieve in any other medium. And I think that is the biggest and most important distinction that video games have earned.